Normandy, June 1944. A man is walking across an open field in France. He is not running. He is not crouching. He is not carrying a weapon. He is carrying a white flag and a Red Cross armband, and he is walking, calmly and deliberately, toward a German position that has been killing Americans all morning. His name is Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan. He is 38 years old. A Jesuit priest from Boston, Massachusetts, former mathematics professor at Holy Cross College. He holds the rank of lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, which makes him technically a non-combatant. He is walking toward the guns anyway. What happens next, over the following 6 hours, will confuse everyone who hears about it, including the German officers who watch it unfold from the other side of the wire. An unarmed man, carrying nothing but a white cloth and a theological argument, will walk in and out of a prisoner of war compound 3 times. He will bring food. He will bring medicine. He will conduct last rites for dying men. And when he finally walks out for the last time, 300 American prisoners of war will walk out behind him. The Germans will let them go. Ostensibly, O'Callaghan is not the story here. The story is how that was possible. How an unarmed chaplain moved through an active combat zone, negotiated with German officers, and extracted 300 men in a single afternoon without firing a shot or losing a single prisoner. The answer reaches back decades before that field in France. It reaches into the legal architecture of modern war, a system of rules that had been hammered out in conference rooms in Geneva and The Hague across 70 years, tested in 4 major wars and very nearly destroyed by the one happening right now. To understand what O'Callaghan walked into and why the Germans let him walk back out, we have to go back to the beginning of that architecture, to the man who first had the idea that war could be governed, and to the single document that made O'Callaghan's white flag mean anything at all. Часть первая. Красный крест и правила войны. In the summer of 1859, a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant was traveling through northern Italy on his way to negotiate a land deal with Napoleon III. He arrived near the town of Solferino on June 24th, the day after a battle between French and Austrian forces that had killed or wounded 40,000 men in less than 12 hours. Dunant was 31 years old. He had no medical training. He had no military affiliation. He was, by his own later account, simply a man who could not walk past what he saw. What he saw was a field covered with the dying, with no one attending to them. Austrian and French soldiers lay within meters of each other, and nobody was treating either side. The wounded were dying of thirst. They were dying of untreated hemorrhage. They were dying because the armies of both nations had collapsed their medical infrastructure in the chaos of the battle, and there was no system in place to recover it. Dunant spent 3 days organizing local women and volunteers to treat the wounded. He didn't ask which side the men belonged to. He didn't have enough supplies to be selective. He just worked. 3 years later, in 1862, he published a book called Un souvenir de Solferino, a memory of Solferino. It contained 2 proposals that would change the legal architecture of warfare permanently. The first, every nation should maintain a permanent, trained volunteer corps of neutral medical personnel who could treat the wounded of any army. The second, those personnel should be protected by international treaty. They should be identifiable. They should be untouchable. The symbol he proposed was a red cross on a white background, the inverse of the Swiss flag, as a tribute to his own country. Stop and think about what Dunant was actually proposing. He was not proposing that war become less violent. He was not proposing that nations stop fighting. He was proposing something more limited and more radical at the same time. That war could have rules, and that those rules could be enforced not by armies, but by mutual agreement. that the legal category of non-combatant could be made real and durable enough to survive contact with an actual battlefield. In 1864, 12 European nations signed the First Geneva Convention. It was a single document, 11 articles long. It protected military medical personnel, military chaplains, and the wounded and sick of all armies. It created the Red Cross as a protected symbol. It required armies to care for wounded enemy soldiers. It required armies to allow neutral medical personnel to operate freely. 12 nations, 11 articles. But the principle those articles encoded was enormous, that the laws of war were not just the customs of war, they were binding obligations. They could be violated, and violation had a name, a war crime that carried legal weight. Over the next 80 years, the Geneva framework expanded. The Second Geneva Convention, in 1896, extended protections to naval warfare. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 codified the rules of land warfare, including the treatment of prisoners of war. By 1907, the legal infrastructure governing how wars were fought had grown from 11 articles to over 200 separate provisions. Here is the key detail. The 1907 Hague Convention, specifically the Regulations Respecting the Laws and Customs of War on Land, established that prisoners of war were not the property of the capturing unit. They were the responsibility of the capturing government. They had to be humanely treated. They had to be fed. They could not be killed. And, this is the provision that mattered most on that field in France, their religious needs had to be accommodated. Article 18 of the 1907 Hague Regulations: prisoners of war shall enjoy complete liberty in the exercise of their religion, including attendance at the services of whatever church they may belong to, on the sole condition that they comply with the measures of order and police issued by the military authorities. That article was the legal lever that O'Callaghan would use. Germany had signed the Hague Convention of 1907. Germany had signed the Geneva Convention of 1906. Both agreements were in force in 1944. Both had been, in various theaters of the war, serially violated by German forces: the Commissar Order, the murder of Soviet POWs, the treatment of Jews, Roma, and civilians throughout occupied Europe. The Nazi regime had demonstrated repeatedly and systematically that it considered these conventions applicable only when convenient. But here is the thing about legal architecture. It is never uniformly enforced or uniformly violated. In the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht and SS units murdered Soviet prisoners at a rate that left approximately 3.3 million men dead in German captivity by the end of the war. In the Western Front, against American and British prisoners, the compliance rate was dramatically, almost paradoxically, higher. Approximately 1% of American POs held by Germany died in captivity. Against Soviet prisoners, the death rate was closer to 57%. The difference was not German mercy. The difference was calculation. The Wehrmacht officer corps in the West understood that the war against the Western Allies was a war that Germany was, by 1944, very probably going to lose. The laws of war, applied to Western prisoners, were partly an insurance policy, protection for German prisoners held by the Americans and British, and partly a reflection of an ideological hierarchy in which Slavic and Jewish lives were expendable and American lives were not. That calculation, cold, rational, self-interested, is what made the white flag in O'Callaghan's hand mean something. Not German decency, German self-interest, expressed through a legal framework that both sides had signed and both sides in this particular theater had reason to maintain. By the time O'Callaghan reached France in the summer of 1944, that framework had been tested in 4 years of war in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. It had held, imperfectly, unevenly, but
recognizably, on the Western Front. The red cross on a white background still meant something. Not everything, but enough. The Chaplain and the Compound. To understand what O'Callaghan actually did on that day in Normandy, you need to understand what he was before the war, because it matters. Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan was born in Boston on May 14, 1905. He was the son of Irish Catholic immigrants raised in the triple-decker neighborhoods of Roxbury and educated by the Jesuits at Boston College High School before entering the Society of Jesus himself. He was ordained a priest in 1934. By 1940, he was teaching mathematics and philosophy at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, a Jesuit institution with about 1,200 students and a reputation for rigorous intellectual formation. He was not a warrior. He was a mathematician. He was a philosopher.
He was a priest who had spent his adult life in classrooms and chapels, and when he entered the Navy as a chaplain in 1940, he was 35 years old, 12 years removed from his last contact with physical danger, and completely without military training in any conventional sense. What he had instead was something harder to quantify and, on that field in France, considerably more useful. He had the Jesuit formation. He had in particular the Jesuit tradition of argumentation, the cura personalis, the care for the whole person, and the casuistry, the case-by-case moral reasoning that the Society of Jesus had developed over 4 centuries of operating in hostile environments. He knew how to make an argument. He knew how to make it calmly. He knew how to make it to an adversary who had every material advantage and no obvious reason to listen. He also knew, with precision, which laws applied to which situation. Now, here is the specific situation O'Callaghan walked into. In the days following the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944, American forces pushing inland. This is the context that the history books usually skip. Those German officers were not in a position of strength. They were in a position of extreme inconvenience. 300 American prisoners represented a logistical burden: food, water, guards, medical attention, that a unit fighting a losing defensive action in the bocage was not equipped to manage. The prisoners were also, under the Hague regulations, a legal liability. If those men died in German custody from neglect or violence, the officers responsible could, in theory, be prosecuted. The German officers knew they were probably going to lose this war. They knew the Americans would be asking questions about prisoner treatment when it was over. They were, in other words, looking for a way out of a problem they hadn't asked for and couldn't solve. O'Callaghan gave them one. His first approach was straightforward. He walked to the perimeter of the compound under a white flag, identified himself as a chaplain, and requested permission to enter under Article 18 of the Hague Regulations, the provision requiring that prisoners be allowed to practice their religion. He was unarmed. He was in uniform. He was carrying identification. He was, legally, exactly what he said he was: a non-combatant chaplain exercising his treaty-protected right to minister to prisoners. The German officer at the perimeter, a lieutenant by most accounts, refused. O'Callaghan repeated the request. He cited the specific article. He cited Germany's treaty obligations. He waited. Hold that image for a moment. An unarmed American officer, standing in the open in an active combat zone, quoting international law to a German lieutenant who was holding a rifle and 300 prisoners. The lieutenant went to find his commanding officer. The commanding officer came out, heard the argument, and made a decision that every account of the episode agrees on. He let O'Callaghan in. Why? Because the legal argument was correct, and the German officer knew it. Because refusing entry to a chaplain exercising his treaty rights was a documentable violation that would be harder to explain after the war than granting entry. Because O'Callaghan was not asking for the prisoner's release. He was asking for access. And access, under the treaty framework, was something the German officer had an obligation to provide. O'Callaghan entered the compound and spent approximately 2 hours inside. He conducted a field mass. He heard confessions. He administered last rites to 3 men who were dying of wounds. He also, with the German officer's knowledge, assessed the compound's conditions, the food supply, the water, the medical situation. And he was not quiet about what he found. He came back out and told the Germans exactly what he had observed. The prisoners were malnourished, several were seriously wounded and not receiving adequate treatment, and the conditions of the compound did not meet the minimum standards required under the Geneva Convention. He was not making a moral argument. He was making a legal one. He was, in effect, issuing a formal complaint under international law, standing in a field in Normandy, to officers of an army that was losing the war. He then asked to be allowed to bring food and medical supplies in on his next visit. The German commanding officer agreed. This is the moment where O'Callaghan's approach becomes genuinely remarkable, because what he was doing, systematically, visit by visit, was establishing a pattern of compliance. Each time the Germans allowed him in, they were reinforcing the precedent that this compound operated under the Geneva and Hague frameworks. Each time they accepted his food and medicine, they were accepting his characterization of the compound's obligations. They were, without fully realizing it, allowing him to redefine the terms of the situation. He came back a second time with food. He came back a third time with medical supplies and a Navy corpsman, arguing that the corpsman was a medical non-combatant entitled to the same protections as himself. The Germans let the corpsman in. And then O'Callaghan made his final argument, the argument at the wire. The third visit was different. O'Callaghan arrived at the perimeter in the late afternoon, and this time he was not just carrying food. He was carrying a document. The document was a formal written statement, prepared by O'Callaghan himself, in English and in a version translated into German by a bilingual American officer, asserting that the conditions of the compound constituted a violation of Article 13 of the Geneva Convention of 1906, which required that prisoners of war be treated humanely and that the sick and wounded receive the medical care their condition required. The document listed specific deficiencies: inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate medical treatment for the wounded. It listed the names of 3 men who had died of wounds in the compound since its establishment. It cited the applicable treaty articles by number. It was, in essence, a legal brief, written by a Jesuit mathematician-philosopher-priest standing in a field in Normandy, addressed to the commanding officer of a Wehrmacht unit that was losing a war. At the bottom of the document, O'Callaghan had written a single sentence that is the closest thing this story has to a quote anchor, recorded in multiple subsequent accounts of the episode. The undersigned requests that these men be released to Allied medical care in accordance with their rights under the Geneva Convention. Stop. Read that again. He was not asking for a prisoner exchange. He was not offering anything in return. He was making a legal demand, in accordance with their rights, as if the outcome were a matter of procedure rather than power, as if the 300 men behind the wire were not prisoners of a German army, but citizens of an international legal order that had the authority to release them.
The German commanding officer, a major, according to the most detailed account of the episode, from the records of the Army Judge Advocate General's office compiled in 1945, took the document and withdrew to consult with his superior officer, a lieutenant colonel commanding the regiment. What happened in that consultation is not recorded. We have no transcript, no diary entry, no post-war testimony from the German officers involved. What we have is the outcome. Approximately 40 minutes later, the major returned to the perimeter and informed O'Callaghan that the prisoners would be released. all 300 of them. The release took approximately 90 minutes. The prisoners were formed into a column. O'Callaghan walked at the front. The German guards stood to either side of the gate as the column passed through. No shots were fired. No one ran. No one was hurt.
300 American soldiers and airmen walked out of that compound in the late afternoon of a June day in Normandy. And they walked out because a Jesuit priest from Boston had spent 6 hours constructing a legal argument compelling enough that a German major decided it was less dangerous to comply than to refuse. Now, here is what the history almost always gets wrong about this. The standard telling of the O'Callaghan episode, when it is told at all, which is not often, frames it as a story of individual heroism. The brave chaplain who walked toward the guns, the unarmed man who talked the Germans into surrender. And that framing is not wrong, exactly. O'Callaghan was brave. His conduct required exceptional personal courage. But the framing misses the mechanism. O'Callaghan didn't talk the Germans into anything. He didn't charm them. He didn't appeal to their better nature. He applied legal leverage, specific, documented, treaty-based legal leverage, to officers who understood that they were operating in a context where that leverage was real. The mechanism was the law. The courage was in knowing the law well enough to use it, and in being willing to walk into range of the guns to apply it. And here is the cruelest irony of the whole episode. The legal architecture O'Callaghan used to free those 300 men was the same architecture that the German state had systematically destroyed on the Eastern Front. The same conventions, the same articles, the same treaty obligations. Applied in France to American prisoners, they worked. Applied in Russia to Soviet prisoners, they had been discarded before the ink was dry. The law didn't save 3 million Soviet prisoners. The law saved 300 Americans. The difference was not the law. The difference was the calculation of who, in the eyes of the German officer corps, counted as a person to whom the law applied. Людям вроде Джозефа О'Каллахана было важно знать не только то, что закон существует, но и то, где именно проходит его граница. And in Normandy, in June 1944, he found the edge of that boundary and walked right up to it. If this investigation gives you a clearer picture of what the Geneva Conventions looked like in practice, not the version in the textbooks, but the version where an unarmed priest is standing in a field citing article numbers to a German officer with a rifle, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of story visible a little longer, and that matters. Часть 4. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Joseph O'Callaghan's achievement at that compound in Normandy was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not the product of German mercy or individual German decency, though some of the officers involved may well have been decent men. It was the product of a specific legal and strategic convergence that made compliance more rational than refusal. Let's audit that convergence precisely. First, the treaty framework was real, and both parties knew it. Germany had signed the Geneva and Hague Conventions. The Wehrmacht Officer Corps on the Western Front was, by 1944, operating under a rational understanding that the war was probably lost and that post-war accountability was a genuine risk. The International Committee of the Red Cross had been documenting conditions in Western Front POW camps since 1941. American and British POW treatment was a matter of ongoing diplomatic and legal record. German officers who violated the conventions against Western prisoners were not operating in a documentation vacuum. They were operating in a situation where violations left a paper trail that would survive the war. Second, O'Callaghan's specific legal argument was correct and unanswerable. He cited the right articles. He identified specific, documentable violations. He made his complaint in writing,
in both languages, with the names of the dead attached. He gave the German commanding officer no procedural escape. The choice was compliance or a documented, named violation of a treaty obligation. For an officer who expected to survive the war and be accountable for his conduct, that was not a close call. Third, the prisoners were a burden, not an asset. 300 American POWs in a compound in the Norman Bocage were not tactically useful to a Wehrmacht unit under pressure from the Allied advance. They required guards, men the unit couldn't spare. They required food, supplies the unit was short of. They were a liability in every practical sense. O'Callaghan's demand for their release was, from the German commanding officer's perspective, an offer to solve a problem. The legal argument gave him a procedurally defensible reason to accept the offer. Fourth, and most important, O'Callaghan understood all three of the above factors before he walked to the wire. This was not improvisation. This was not spontaneous bravery. This was a man who had thought carefully about the legal and strategic situation, identified the specific leverage available to him, and applied it with precision. The Jesuit formation, the training in rigorous argumentation, in case-by-case moral reasoning, in identifying the specific principle that governs the specific situation, was not incidental to what he did. It was the instrument. Now hold the other side of this verdict. The same legal architecture that worked in Normandy was failing catastrophically in other theaters at the same moment. In the spring of 1944, approximately 100,000 Soviet prisoners were dying in German captivity every month, not from combat, from deliberate starvation, exposure, and summary execution. The Hague regulations that O'Callaghan cited were no less binding in those camps than they were in that Norman field. The Geneva Convention of 1906 was no less in force. The difference was not the law. The difference was that the German military political apparatus had made a determination, explicit, documented in the Commissar Order of June 1941 and the subsequent policy directives, that Soviet prisoners were not persons to whom the law applied. The law is only as real as the calculation of the parties who hold the guns. O'Callaghan walked into a situation where the calculation favored compliance. He walked in knowing it favored compliance. His courage was real. Walking across an open field toward a German position in an active combat zone is not something most people will do, regardless of their legal arguments. But his courage was not blind. It was informed. It was calculated. It was the courage of a man who had done the math and decided the odds were acceptable. He was, after all, a mathematician. What happened to the men involved? The 300 American prisoners released that day were processed through Allied medical and intelligence facilities over the following week. Most were reassigned to their units. Some of the wounded were evacuated to England. The records of the Army Judge Advocate General's Office, which compiled the most detailed account of the episode in 1945, do not name the German officers involved. They are listed by rank and unit designation only. The major who made the final decision to release the prisoners has never been publicly identified. Joseph O'Callaghan continued his service as a Navy chaplain through the end of the war. On March 19, 1945, he was serving aboard the aircraft carrier USS Franklin when the ship was struck by 2 Japanese bombs while operating 60 miles off the coast of Japan. The Franklin suffered the worst damage ever sustained by a carrier that survived. 832 men killed, 270 wounded, the ship's forward sections consumed by fire and exploding ordnance. O'Callaghan, then 40 years old, spent hours moving through the burning ship, administering last rites, directing damage control, organizing firefighting efforts, physically moving men away from burning aircraft. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his conduct on that day becoming the first Navy chaplain to receive the decoration. He returned to Holy Cross College after the war. He taught mathematics and philosophy. He published a memoir, I Was Chaplain on the Franklin, in 1956. He died on March 18, 1964, in Worcester, Massachusetts, at the age of 58. He is buried at Holy Cross. The episode in Normandy, the compound, the 300 prisoners, the legal argument at the wire, is not mentioned in the Medal of Honor citation. It happened 9 months before the Franklin. It was documented in the JAG records and largely forgotten. It deserves not to be forgotten. Because what O'Callaghan demonstrated in that Norman field was something more durable than personal heroism and more complicated than a story about a brave priest. He demonstrated that legal architecture, the slow, unglamorous work of treaty negotiation and international convention, the work of men in conference rooms in Geneva and The Hague across 70 years, could, under the right conditions, function exactly as its designers intended. That the red cross on a white background could mean something real in a field where men were shooting at each other. That the words, in accordance with their rights under the Geneva Convention, could, in the right mouth at the right moment, carry enough weight to open a gate. Not everywhere, not always, not for everyone. But in Normandy, in June 1944, for 300 specific men, it worked. And when those men walked out of that compound in the late afternoon light, O'Callaghan walking at the front of the column, the German guards standing aside at the gate, what that image represented was not a triumph of individual courage over military power. It was a proof of concept. Evidence that the architecture of international law, built by men who had seen what war looked like at Solferino and wanted to believe it could be governed, was not entirely a fiction. Henri Dunant published Un Souvenir de Solferino in 1862. He proposed that war could have rules, and that those rules could be made binding. 82 years later, a Jesuit priest from Boston used those rules to walk 300 men out of a prisoner of war compound in France. Dunant won the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901. He died in 1910, nearly destitute, in a Swiss nursing home, having spent most of his fortune on the Red Cross movement and most of his later years in obscurity. He didn't live to see Normandy. He didn't live to see what his 11 articles became when they met the right person who knew how to use them. But the document O'Callaghan carried to that wire, the one that ended with, in accordance with their rights under the Geneva Convention, that document was Dunant's argument, made real in a field in France 80 years after the first conference room in Geneva. The law held for 300 men on one afternoon. That is not everything, but it is not nothing.